Welcome to the Hardy Woods Podcast. I'm your host, Colin Fraser. We're getting to the summer months, and things are mightily green, but not all the plants that we encounter in the woods and the fields and clearings, and even on our own lawns, are welcome. Invasive species are plants that have arrived onto the landscape from a different part of the world and are disrupting native ecosystems. Invasive plants can cause problems in lots of different ecosystems, fields and wetlands, and even underwater. But today we're going to discuss the plants that can cause problems in and around the eastern hardwood forests. And here to talk about these plants is Zoe Bergman. Zoe is Research Program Manager for the Department of Forestry in Charlottesville, Virginia. Her work focuses on a broad range of applied research topics, including improved silviculture for both pine and hardwood forests, diminished species restoration, including chestnut recovery, growth and yield of timber species, tree improvement in genetics, and orchard and nursery management. After getting her master's degree from the University of Virginia's Environmental Sciences Department, Zoe worked as an area forester in Rappahannock region for the Virginia Department of Forestry, which included forest management, fire suppression, and prescribed burns. Also, water quality monitoring. Zoe, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, as we get started, I think that a good way to begin would be just to define invasive species, because there are a lot of non-native plants growing around, and a lot of what we grow to eat or plant in our yards is not technically native. So what makes a non-native species count as invasive?
Yeah, so an invasive species has a few different points that make it invasive. So the first is that it's non-native, so it's outside of its native range. It doesn't belong there normally, so it's often moved there by humans, whether that's through intentional plantings for ornamental purposes, or accidentally coming in on like nursery stock from another country. So it doesn't naturally grow there. And an invasive species has to cause some sort of ecological or economical harm, or even human health harm. So there are some invasive species that can actually hurt people, and that's another reason it may be categorized as invasive. So like you were saying, Colin, we have like our tomato and a lot of our wheat and our potatoes. Those are all non-native species to the United States, but they're not invasive because they're not causing these issues within our ecosystems or impacting like our economy or profits. And so they're kind of just there. A lot of those actually can't grow by themselves, like they won't assimilate into our ecosystem. And that's where we can get to things that are naturalized. So that's another different term that we use. A naturalized species is one that has come in post-colonization. So it wasn't there pre-colonization, but it has kind of assimilated into our native ecosystems, but it's not causing any ecological harm or economic harm or anything like that. They're kind of just growing in there. And a good example that everyone is actually surprised about is dandelion. So that
Really?
wasn't here. Yeah. And so it's often categorized as invasive, but it's not actually causing any harm. You might not like it in your lawn, but it's not doing anything. And it's actually a pretty good early forage for pollinators. It comes out earlier than a lot of other flowers. So dandelion is a good one for a naturalized species. And then again, the invasives are causing harm and they're also non-native.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really important distinction, that invasives they can support themselves and expand on their own.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at invasive species, and they're defined a lot more by what they do than where they came from, right? And one of the Department of Forestry lists one of the characteristics as altering ecosystem processes. Can you give us a couple examples of that?
Yes, definitely. So first, what ecosystem processes are is basically just the like things that happen in an ecosystem, like succession, which if you don't know what succession is, there are two kinds. There's primary succession, secondary succession. Primary is starting from like basic, like a volcano happens, what grows after that. Secondary succession is much more common, and that's often what invasive species are impacting. But it's just the natural like trajectory of land as it goes from somewhere that may be a fire burned into a grassland, into a shrubland, into a forest, and eventually into like our mature native forests here in Virginia. Another example would be like changing a fire regime. So how often burns may happen across the landscape. And so if plants come in and their fuel type is different than what it used to be, it may change a fire regime. So those are different types of ecosystem processes. And so a lot of times these invasives will come in and they'll displace whatever natives are there, and they can actually change these natural processes that we would see in our ecosystem. And when you change those types of things, you're also going to change the wildlife that are able to live there. You're going to change ecosystem services that ecosystem might be providing. And when you're thinking about that, like ecosystem services are things like carbon sequestration, so pulling that carbon out of the air and holding it into plant biomass. Things like soil erosion, which was a really big problem for the US, like that's what caused the Dust Bowl. And so a lot of times invasive species will have different root systems than natives, and they won't hold soil as well. Water purification, and then things like ecosystem resilience and resistance. So basically that ecosystem's ability to come back from things like natural disaster. So when invasives get in, they can cause disruptions to those types of processes, and in turn cause issues with ecosystem services for things that are important to us.
Yeah. So one of the other Department of Forestry qualifiers for an invasive species is that it negatively impacts vulnerable species or habitat. And one of the things I've been wondering about, because I know it's happened in animal communities as well, that a species will expand its range without being transported by human activity, right? Like I know it's happened with coyotes and barred owls and gray squirrels, armadillos. I mean, nobody planted armadillos in the East, but they're coming. And presumably they're going to have an impact. So does that, and it might even happen more with plants due to climate change, as things are going to change their range. So does that count as something to combat as an invasive species?
So no, range expansion wouldn't be something that we would categorize as an invasive species. And so a lot of our ranges are changing of our native species as climate changes and it gets warmer, higher on the mountains, and like species like loblolly pine its northernmost range is starting to move up. So we are already seeing that, but that wouldn't be an invasive species. Although
Okay.
invasive species, they don't have to be moved by humans. They most often are. They don't have to be, but they have to be causing some sort of harm. And so that range expansion is often something that's happening naturally. And the species that the expanding species are coming into their ecosystem, they're often moving as well because of that climate change. So it's kind of just like big movement as they're able to survive in larger areas. And that does cause some issues, when you're pushing things like red spruce, which is a high elevation species. It's kind of pushing them off the mountaintop. So we do see that, but that wouldn't be caused by like an invasive species issue. That's just range expansion.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about the damage that they do to these ecosystems, like in forestry, what kind of problems do they cause, these invasive plants?
Yeah, so a lot of different kinds. So when I was a forester in Fauquier County, I got to see a lot of it. And when areas get disturbed is most often when these species can come in. And the problem is they come in so thick because invasive species are really good at reproducing. So things like autumn olive, which we'll touch on more later, is a shrub that makes tons and tons of berries, and it's dispersed by birds. So you have an area that was burned, or an area that was harvested, or an area that was an old field, and they come in and they just grow so thick. And it's a monoculture, so only autumn olive will be able to grow in there. And they kind of shade out anything that tries to grow underneath it. And they're kind of putting this land into arrested succession. So I think that's most often what I see as a problem in forestry is I talked about succession, this natural trajectory. the invasives come in and they basically like stop succession. So you're not getting that colonization from your native species like tulip poplar and oaks and hickories, because you get stuck in this shrub phase, because these plants are so good at competing because they came from somewhere else where, and in their original range, wherever it may be, they probably have some enemies or some competitors. They come here and it's brand new, and
Mm-hmm.
none of these competitors live there. They don't have many native or many pests or pathogens that are there, and so they're able to outcompete our native species, and then they kind of keep them out, which is the main problem. We're not seeing that movement. So if you look at a land that was covered in autumn olive, 20 years ago, it looks the same. Whereas if you looked at a native forest ecosystem 20 years ago and now, it looks pretty different, because you have different species
Mm-hmm.
coming in and they kind of die out and change as time goes by. And so we're not getting to that good ecosystem that we like, that has a lot of timber profit, for example, like your oaks, your
Mm-hmm.
hickories, your tulip poplars, even your pines. You're staying in this shrub phase with the invasive species.
I'm reminded a little bit too of one of the ones we can talk about later is stilt grass, um, and when you see it in forest openings, our native wildlife doesn't eat it, so it's like two problems, because it took up space from a native plant, and then also it's not supporting the native wildlife. Like deer don't eat it, um, and so then I guess it's causing a couple different problems.
Yeah,
Um,
actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something we actually didn't touch on that I think is important to talk about. Is you're right. So the deer aren't eating it, but that also means the deer are eating the native competitors, and they're leaving the stilt grass behind. And so the deers are actually really helping the invasive species, because they're eating any native competitors that could be there and leaving this thing that they don't like, which then just causes like this positive reinforcement for the invasive species. And we see
mhm,
that a lot. Like most invasive species are not palatable species for our native, or yeah, for our native wildlife. And things like oftentimes they're berries, like autumn olive berries or wineberry berries, which is it's an invasive rubus, looks like blackberry.
mhm.
They don't have a lot of vitamins and nutrients that wildlife needs. It's kind of like candy for wildlife, and wildlife behaves like a toddler sometimes, and they're going to eat what's there and what's good, and that's not necessarily what's best for them. So it can cause like nutrient deficiencies in wildlife if they're eating these invasive species that don't contain the stuff that they need.
That's really interesting. You can kind of, with that example, you can see how, a new species becoming dominant. I imagine if it were really palatable to animals, then it wouldn't really get established. It would get eaten. Um, so it kind of makes its own gravy in that way, that it can continue to kind of be a wrench in the natural system. It's
Yeah,
interesting.
it's missing those checks and balances that native species have.
So I wanted to talk about some of our Virginia relevant invasive species. And we used to refer to this as the most wanted list. I'm not sure if that's exactly what we call it now, but there are some species that are causing a lot of trouble in terms of forestry and in agriculture, especially in hay production and around cattle operations, as well as you can lose pasture value too.
Yeah.
So the whole list is available on the DCR website. That's Department of Conservation and Recreation. So is a government list of these that you can look up. And, honestly, this would be easier if we had pictures, but this is an audio medium. So I think if we just talked about a few of the highest profile ones, that would maybe be a good example of the issues that they can cause and how these plants operate. Do any of these come to mind for you?
Yeah, as we've already talked about, autumn olive. That's one of the main ones. That's a shrub. Tree of heaven is another big one, and that one is a tree. It behaves more like a tree than a shrub. Stilt grass, which we've already touched on. Bittersweet, which is a really important invasive vine in our forests. So, and stilt grass we touched on. Multiflora rose is another one that we see really commonly. and calorie pair is easy to identify in the early spring. So I think those are some we could touch on. So I'll start with autumn olive. I've kind of given you some information on it already. It was initially introduced for erosion control. I will say a lot of our state agencies unfortunately recommended planting this some 50, 60 years ago, when we didn't know that it was going to be a problem. And to be honest with you, invasive species are a more recent realized issue. We weren't thinking about what problems they could cause for our ecosystem. Really, one of the big ones that kind of started the wait a second, invasive species might be a problem was the American chestnut blight that happened in about 1904, and that was kind of a catalyst for maybe bringing things in and having them get into our ecosystem isn't the best idea. So we didn't necessarily know. So we were recommending people plant things like autumn olive. We said it was good for bird and pollinators and erosion. And so a lot of landowners were planting this on their property. And that's one of the reasons it's so widespread, is it did get a really good start from people planting it. But past that, autumn olive has most of the characteristics that a lot of common invasive species have, which is really fast growth rates, often faster than native species. They have higher photosynthetic capacities, which really just means they have like more of the machinery needed to use more sunlight to grow faster. And so they're better at it than native species. They also tend to have higher nitrogen contents and take up nitrogen more readily in the soil than native plants. And in our ecosystems, a lot of the limiting factors of growth is nitrogen. And so since they're able to take that up faster, it makes them more competitive. They're released from their native enemies. Like we were talking about, they're not in their native range. And a lot of times plants and, bacteria and animals and fungus, they all co-evolve with each other over, long thousands of years and kind of coexist and have these checks and balances with each other. And when they move to a new area, they don't have those. Another thing that a lot of invasives have that autumn olive, we're not sure if it has this, there hasn't been enough research done, but is what's called allelopathy. And that is when a plant can basically make like compounds in the soil that make it inhospitable to other plants. So basically can't grow other plants. And so a lot of species we think use this. It's something that's really hard to experiment in the field and test for in the field. And so a lot of times we can see it in greenhouse, but we don't have any way to say this is 100% what's happening, in the soil, in the field, but we think this is happening. Tree of Heaven is another one that uses it. So autumn olive uses a whole suite of these different types of traits that invasives have to just outgrow natives. And it just stays in this really aggressive monoculture of a shrub. And so, we don't go through the native succession. And so that's autumn olive plus some more information about, why invasives are invasive.
Yeah, it's real locally to us. It is really pernicious. And you see it on roadsides. I think if you stopped mowing your lawn for a month, you'd end up with autumn olive popping up around here. It's really everywhere. And then Tree of Heaven is another one of those, I think, right? I mean, it tends to come up just about if you leave well enough alone, it comes up.
Yep, basically. And these are ones that if you're driving down a highway, I can almost 100% assure you if you're on that highway for longer than 10 miles, you're probably going to see both of these. Autumn olive is really distinct because the bottom of its leaves are like a silver sparkly like look to them. So they're pretty easy to identify like that. Tree of Heaven. So this is, it kind of looks like walnut. Its leaves, it has these long compound leaves. There's actually a gland at the base of each leaflet on the Tree of Heaven, which is a good way to differentiate it from black walnut if you can like look at those leaves. They smell. So Tree of Heaven smells really strongly. If you break it and smell it, to me it smells like burnt peanut butter. But really the important thing is it smells. And a lot of things in the forest you can use, I call it scratch and sniff. So that's one way you could identify it. They do a lot of the same things as autumn olive, except for they can actually get into forest canopies, whereas autumn olive behaves like a shrub. Tree of heaven is a tree. And this
Okay.
one was introduced through ornamental plantings. And so people thought it was really pretty. And so they started planting it in their yard. And so now it's everywhere. It's also a host species for the spotted lanternfly, which
Oh
is
boy.
another, yeah, it's an invasive species of leafhopper that is a big problem that's kind of spreading throughout the eastern US right now. And it would be great if the spotted lanternfly only stayed on the tree of heaven and just ate and killed the tree of heaven. But that's not the case. Unfortunately, they spread
Never
to other
works that
trees
way.
as well. No, that would be really ideal if it did, but unfortunately, yeah, it doesn't do that. And Tree of Heaven is notorious because it's very hard to kill. Because when you cut a Tree of Heaven, it sends up like
Hmm.
30 to 40 little baby sprouts, which is called rhizome sprouting. So it sprouts from its roots a bunch of new trees if it feels stressed or if you cut a big tree. So that's one where it's really useful to use herbicide because if you don't, you just gave yourself a lot more.
I did a tree planting project on a old cornfield. So it was a clean field, planted it in hardwoods, and the deer ate the hardwoods, and I had 1,200 Alanthus seedlings per acre when I did transects. I had planted
Oh
600
no.
hardwoods per acre and ended up with 1,200 Alanthus and no hardwoods. So I'm very, very sympathetic to people who are struggling with trying to limit how much Tree of Heaven is on their property. I think stiltgrass is another one that I end up seeing a lot of, especially around power lines. Interestingly.
Yeah, stiltgrass is a bad one. Quick aside on power lines. Those are some of the worst, like spreading of invasive species because a lot of equipment goes through there. And so they transfer a lot of invasive species, and they're all really high light environments where invasive
Hmm.
species thrive, like they're disturbed all the time. So if you're listening and you do work in power lines, clean your equipment between moving because chances are you're moving a lot of invasive seeds. Just an aside. But yeah, so stiltgrass is really common. Another one that I promise you've seen along a trail on a forest edge. It actually can survive pretty well even in forest understories. Even
Hmm.
when the canopy's closed, like it'll find those little light gaps and it'll grow in there. And it creates this like mat of roots and stiltgrass. And it's really hard for anything else to come up, especially any other like herbaceous species or like native like understory, like forbs, anything like that. Um, but the good thing about stiltgrass, it is really wimpy, and so you can treat it with some pretty light glyphosate, and it will kill the stiltgrass. The other thing you can do with stiltgrass is mow it before it sets seed at the end of summer, and then
Mm.
that way you're not having it reseed. Um,
Okay.
so that works really well. The sad part on that one is stiltgrass has been found to survive in the seed bank for up to 10 years.
Oh
So
boy.
you gotta be really consistent with that mowing for a long period of time. But once your canopy is completely closed, it's much easier to control. It's really in these high light areas that you
Okay.
see a lot of stiltgrass. And it was introduced for erosion control, again, like similar to autumn olive, which is one of the reasons it's so prolific. But we're trying to fix it now. But it does work for erosion control. But there's other things that work better, like native grasses and stuff like that. So.
Hmm. Yeah, I found when I was looking up a lot of these invasive plants, I always wondered why it seemed like the highlight areas and forest openings, disturbances, power lines, which are by definition contiguous open areas, why that was where these things tended to become so dominant. And then when I looked into the history of them, they were picked exactly for that reason because they were erosion control means you are, again, by definition, you are looking for disturbed soil and you want something that can reproduce itself so you don't have to come back and plant. And you want something that covers a lot of ground quickly. So a lot of them were picked for exactly that reason. Another one that I wanted to get to was multiflora rose, which is not as pretty as it sounds.
No, and I have a personal vendetta with multiflora rose because if you've had to crawl through it, it
Hmm.
really hurts. It has these hooked thorns that when they get into your skin, you can't just like back up so they pull out. They'll basically just rip through your skin. So I am not a fan of multiflora rose. It was originally planted in hedgerows and cattle fields, actually, to keep cows from like escaping because it's
It's that
thorny.
sharp, huh?
Yes, yeah, really
Natural,
unpleasant. And you're
natural barbed
right.
wire.
Yes, yeah, that is one of my other names for it when I am cursing it as I'm crawling through it, to light a prescribed burn or take some plots. Um, but yeah, that's another big one. Birds like to eat the rose hips, which helps spread it, and it like is even denser than autumn olive. It's not quite as woody, which makes it a little bit harder to treat if you're trying to treat it with like cut and paint methods or like hack and squirt. Like you can't really do that
Hmm.
with multiflora rose because it's so many bases and it's not like a few big woody stems. And so you often have to foliar spray it, and it's usually mixed in with a bunch of other stuff. And where I've seen it is mostly along riparian edges. So the streams seem to carry it really well. And it just creates like mats. And I mean, I've seen walls of multiflora rose that are like probably like 8 feet high, and it'll crawl along other plants, like crawl up them. Um, and that one, it doesn't host like a lot of good stuff for wildlife. It's another one of those where the vitamins and nutrients just aren't high as like our native roses. It's not very pretty, so it wasn't even introduced for ornamental value. The flowers don't look like roses. They're just like white flowers. Um, and it'll prevent, the same issue with forestry as you're not going to get that succession because seedlings can't grow under these really dense mats that create a bunch of
Hmm.
shade and stuff like that.
Yeah, and next I do want to talk about the difference between like hack and squirt and foliar, which means
Yeah.
on the leaf application. But
Hmm.
I did have a note to myself to talk about bittersweet because I know that for a lot of people on the East Coast, that's going to be pretty familiar.
Yes, yep. And so bittersweet is a vine, and it seems to be able to grow in these like earlier successional habitats as well as our mature forests. And usually it's harder for an invasive species to kind of maintain itself and especially like get into a mature forest, but bittersweet does a pretty good job of getting in on those edges. And what it does is it climbs up the trees and it just grows and it strangles them, and it weighs a lot. Like when you've got like these massive, I mean, I've seen bittersweet as big as like, a grown man's thigh. Like they
Mm.
get massive and they'll pull down the trees. And then when
Hmm.
you pull down a tree, you're also introducing more light, which is good for the bittersweet. So it's going to explode in growth from there. The good news is with bittersweet, you can do things like hack and squirt when you've got those like really big pieces on it. But it has a lot of influence on forestry because it can basically like shade out and pull down these trees while climbing them. And so it'll make a lot of trees less profitable if they're being strangled or if like they're pulling off limbs. Because when they start to strangle the tree, they'll actually girdle it and they can even kill it like that too. So they'll like grow into it. So yeah, definitely a really big problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The last one on my list was the calorie pear, and it's one I'm actually less familiar with. Can you speak on that a little
Yeah.
bit?
Yeah, definitely. So the calorie pear is actually what we call Bradford pear, which when it escapes its original planting. And so Bradford pear was originally planted because it's very pretty. It does very well, like we were talking about, in areas that we wanted it to do well in initially, and now it does too well. But it's really
Hmm.
common in yard trees and neighborhoods. It can withstand like a lot of pollution, and so for that reason, it's often planted like along sidewalks or in parking lots. And it makes flowers in early spring. So it's really easy to identify. It has all of these white flowers on them. They usually
Okay.
smell really bad. So that's another thing that you like, you'll walk along the sidewalk and you'll be like, man, something stinks. It's calorie pear flowers
Hmm.
or Bradford pear flowers, depending where it's growing. And so they've escaped a lot of their plantings. They were thought to be infertile, so they couldn't reproduce. that ended up not being true. And so they make a bunch of these little tiny pears that you could eat. They don't taste very good, but the birds eat them and spread them everywhere. Birds are great dispersers. And then they just come up in things like old fields. In the early spring, you will see it is literally just a sea of these white flowers where it should be a
Mm.
regenerating forest ecosystem. And they'll shade everything out. They'll outcompete the native species. And so that's one that we've kind of been working on for many years to try and reduce the amount we're seeing on like roadsides, in old like agricultural fields, forest edges, stuff like that. But you'll find that one everywhere.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've laid out some of these plants that are causing these ecosystem issues, and I want to move on to what we do when we find them, because Virginia is a heavily forested state, and most of that is privately owned, which means that landowners, normal people, are the first and last line of defense when it comes to issues like invasive species and forest health. So let's talk a little bit about what to do to help support the native ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say don't discount your forest, even if you only have like a few acres, like that's yours. You're the steward of this native ecosystem where like you can make it really habitable for native wildlife, and it's worth it to work on it. And so I worked with a lot of landowners when I was in Fauquier County, with a lot of invasive species. Northern Virginia tends to have a lot more invasive species. This is just anecdotal. I don't have any research on it, but because the population is a lot larger, there tends to be an easier spread of invasive species. And it can be really overwhelming, like, especially when you start to learn them and you're like, oh, wait,
Mm-hmm.
that's invasive, that's invasive, that's invasive. What do I do? So
Mm-hmm.
my first advice is to start small. So I would pick either a species to go after or pick like an area, like plan to do maybe an acre a year is often what I would talk about with my landowners if they had, to get out there and do a little bit after work every day. And there's a few different ways you can deal with invasive species. One of the best ways is using herbicide along with like mechanical removal. And so mechanical
Mm-hmm.
removal is just like clipping, cutting, pulling, which is great. The problem with that is oftentimes invasive species, if you clip it, it can regrow from the roots. Even if you pull it, if you don't get it all, a lot of species like tree of heaven, autumn olive, can regrow from like just a little tiny piece of root that was left in
Mm-hmm.
there. Um, and so using herbicide like glyphosate and triclopyr is usually what we recommend for landowners to use, because they're some pretty safe herbicides that have short soil residence times, which means they don't hang around in the soil and in that chemical like format, and they're not going to have long-term impacts on your plant community. And there's a few different ways to do it. So we talked about foliar. So foliar is when you spray the leaves of the plant. So you can do this on trees, grasses, shrubs, anything. And it's going to soak into the leaves and be pulled down into the plant. And the best time to do that is the end of summer. And the reason
Mm-hmm.
for that is the plants at the end of summer are pulling all of their resources back down into their roots to begin to overwinter. And so they're going to pull that herbicide down with them. And so you have a better kill rate. And a lot of them you could
Okay.
do other times of the year, but that's kind of the best time to do a foliar application. The the drawbacks with foliar is that it's hard to control, right? So you can't not
Drift.
spray something exactly. It's probably going to hit other stuff if there's other stuff in that area, and chances are it's going to kill it, or it's going to have at least
Right.
some impact on it. And so with the woodier species, you can do things like hack and squirt,
We
or
need to
basil
define that one.
spray. Yes. Okay. So hack and squirt is where you can use anything from like a machete to a chainsaw and just hack into the side of the trunk or the, whatever the vine, whatever piece it is. And then you're going to paint or spray herbicide directly where you just cut. And so it's going to pull it in. and you'll want to follow the herbicide label. So I will make the disclaimer that the herbicide label is like what you need to follow for safe application of herbicide, for concentrations, amount applied, what plants to apply it to. That's really important. So you apply it just to where you cut it. And so that makes it a really contained application. It's only going to be in that plant. So the plant's going to pull it down and that plant's going to die. So that's one of my favorite ways. It's also a lot less work because you don't have to like cut the whole thing down for hack and squirt. You can just hack and squirt.
And it dies where it stands. And I think like talking about safe use of these herbicides is really important because I found, really well-meaning, ecologically conscious landowners both experience this with doing some agricultural work and then forestry as well, that people have like probably reasonable hesitance about using herbicides, but they are the best in my experience, and you're the forester, but they are the best tool to control invasives and to help the ecosystem health. And I think that, it's something people should research and get comfortable with. Do you have any advice on that?
Yes, I do. So herbicide has gotten a really bad name, especially glyphosate. You kind of hear and people
Roundup, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Are really worried about it. And like you said, like there is like validity in that. Like it is a chemical. Like it's not something that you can just sling around wherever you want to. But it really helps with this type of stuff. And there's been a lot of research done on it. There's a webinar that I sent you that if you want to share that people can watch about a case study on glyphosate. And
absolutely.
It is such an important tool because these invasive species, although this is a chemical that you're using, these invasive species are having like really long-term influential impacts on the ecosystem. Whereas this herbicide is a tool that's having, if you're doing it in a targeted application, you're doing it in a responsible way, it's going to get rid of these invasives way better than if you try to do it just clipping and removing because they're going to resprout. And it also gives you more bang for your buck. So you're not going to have to go back to the same plant every year for 10 years, clipping it off until it finally runs out of reserves and dies. You can move on to other ones. So really important tool. As long as you follow the label and are conscious of what you're doing, it's a super helpful tool. It's been proved that it doesn't have long-term impacts on the soil. Would I like to have a silver bullet and say like, oh, you don't have to do this, you can just do that? Yes, I would. Like it would be great if we didn't have to use it, but it is the best tool that we have for this type of work. So I think I 100% agree with you. People should research it for themselves and make sure they feel comfortable with it. But I think don't just write it off because you've heard maybe about how bad it can be.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I appreciate that. So like when we're looking at places, we mentioned earlier that successional areas are particularly vulnerable to getting overrun by invasive species. So what's your best practices advice for landowners if they're doing like tree planting or they're allowing something to go from an open area into trees to make sure that it doesn't just become like an autumn olive patch or a tree of heaven patch?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So two things. The first thing I want to touch on is give natives a fighting chance. If you can get in there when everything's just starting to come up, then you can choose what moves on in that area. And so if you have natives mixed in, focus on just removing the invasives that are competing with those natives, because the native species, they'll keep growing. If you can help them get a head start above these invasives, they're going to keep growing and they're eventually going to get thick enough and make like a canopy and kind of start to do your job for you. They're going to start to shade out those invasive species. And so just help your natives. And if you don't have a lot of natives there and you're removing invasive species, plant back natives behind you. Because if you don't, the invasive species are just going to come back. So that's something that's actually written into a lot of different cost shares and like invasive species programs, where if we're going to give you money to remove these, you have to also plant something back, because otherwise you're just going to get the same issues going to come back in just like they did the first time. And so you can also kind of use like cultural control, so planting aggressive native species that are better at competing with the invasive species. So it'll depend like where you're planting, but things like spicebush is a native shrub that grows really well and really thickly, and you can plant it like where you're removing autumn olive if it's the right area, and it'll grow
Mm-hmm.
really well and it'll compete with that autumn olive. So you're kind of, introducing the natives to fight the invasives for you, after you've helped remove them. And then the second point that I really like to talk to landowners about is getting to people before they make these disturbances. So before they harvest or before they, start clearing or burning or something like that, get
Mm-hmm.
your invasives under control before you do that. Because if you do, you're going to give the natives a much better chance to grow and come in. Whereas if you just leave your understory of autumn olive and clear your overstory of, pine or hardwood, you basically just released all of that autumn olive to the sun, and it's going to go crazy, and it's going to be much, much harder to deal with after it's had full sun for, 2 or 3 years. So get it
Sure.
under control before you do that disturbance. I think that's the number one easiest way to combat if you have, that ability to do it before you actually introduce a disturbance. That's the best
Uh-huh.
way to keep them under control.
So, I know that the Department of Forestry has assistance to landowners. We've mentioned it, when you're talking about how to prepare for a harvest, prepare for any kind of land management project, that this is something you should keep in mind. Where would you point people to find those resources?
Yeah, so there is a bunch of different kinds. The Department of Forestry has a really great invasive species treatment pamphlet that they can find online if they just Google Virginia Department of Forestry invasive species treatment. It should come up. It's a PDF. I think I also sent you a link if you have somewhere to post links. And
Absolutely.
that tells you like the time of year, the type of species, what to treat it with, how to treat it, if you're going to use hack and squirt or foliar spray, which I'm realizing now we didn't finish. I'll quickly go through. Cut stump is another thing people will use, which is where you completely cut the woody species and you paint that stump with herbicide. So it's going to pull
Mm-hmm.
it down. It's going to kill it. And then basil spray, you don't have to cut anything. You just spray the base of the tree or the shrub with herbicide, and it kind of soaks through the bark and into the tree. So that one's like probably the least amount of work for a targeted application. So those are the different kinds. So this pamphlet will tell you if you're going to do that, when to do it, how to do it, and stuff like that. So there's also a great agency called Blue Ridge Prism that
Okay.
focuses on invasive species advice. As far as I know right now, they don't have any like cost share programs to help, but you can call them out and they'll give you like specific advice on how to treat your invasives and like what to do specifically with your land, so that it's tailored a little more towards you. You can always call out your area forester from the Department of
Mm-hmm.
Forestry. So, yep, every county has an area forester. Very easy to find. Just look it up online, like Department of Forestry, who is my forester? And you can find out, and they can come out and also give you advice on what to do, give you more information for your specific county. We also work with the Natural Resource Conservation Service quite a lot, NRCS, and they actually have cost share programs that you can qualify for, and you basically apply. And if you get into it, you get part of the treatment paid for or reimbursed by NRCS for things like removing invasives and planting trees, or removing invasives and making it into a native meadow. And so there's all different kinds of programs that they have. And honestly, your best contact for that is probably also your area forester, because they work closely with NRCS. Another one that's a little more local, because NRCS is a federal agency, the Soil and Water Conservation District. So most counties have one. And so you can ask your area forester about that. And they will often work with landowners who have agriculture. They want to do a lot of tree plantings on like riparian buffers. And
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes that includes like site prep, which often includes removing invasive species to plant trees back. And there's cost share programs for that as well. And then even for smaller acreage, I believe the Soil and Water Conservation District has programs for smaller acreages as well that are specific for, it's like acres under maybe like 10 or 5, for programs for things like removing invasives, installing less impervious surfaces, rain gardens, stuff like that. So there's a lot of different resources out there that you can look at. There is also something I would like to plug from the Department of Forestry. We have a semi-new program called the Hardwood Initiative, which is run
Mm-hmm.
by Joe Rossetti, who works at the Department of Forestry. And it is a great program. Basically, it's to manage your hardwood forests. And a lot of times included in that is a plan for removing invasive species, or even if it's not just invasives, basically removing or changing the composition of your forest to meet your goals. And so that's something that does have a cost share attached to it that would again be reaching out to your area forester. So a lot of good stuff to look at. I'm sure there's more. If I think of more, I'll send them to you to put out. But yeah, so there's a lot of different options for help with this, and they're only growing. They're getting bigger. So since I've started, there has been more money and more like effort put into the invasive species issue than has been in past years. So it's exciting. We're going big places.
That's really, really helpful. And, I think that like one of the important things to think about when we talk about this as a problem is to kind of stay positive and stay proactive at it. Because once you learn, as we did at the beginning, once we learn to identify the problems that invasive species can cause, and then some of the specifics, and then as you mentioned, you start seeing them everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I can look out my window and see privet and tree of heaven. But we've got to think about it, at least I like to think about it, as helping support native ecosystems. Like, keep it positive, and in all of your projects, all those resources are there for landowners to learn how to control these things, how to responsibly use chemical applications, and the Department of Forestry is there for you. I mean, I'm always amazed with how accessible these resources are and how excited people are to help you. So I would encourage anyone listening who is interested in supporting their the ecosystem on the land that they control, to use these experts, because they're there for you. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're here for. And if you're in our field, you usually really love what you do. So chances are we're going to come out super excited to talk to you about plants for however long you want. So
you guys are great. You guys are great. And on that note, I would like to thank you so much for coming on and for sharing all this information. I learned a ton getting ready to talk to you, and even more talking to you. And I hope that our listeners did as well. I think it's important stuff, and hopefully people can follow up and keep learning, keep doing the right thing. So Zoe, thank you so much for coming on.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.